When I opened the front door and saw him standing there, with that suitcase in his hand and the same dimpled smile I remembered from all those years ago, something inside me twisted in a way I couldn't name. It wasn't guilt, not yet. And it wasn't desire, at least not in the way I understood it back then. It was something much quieter, much older, like the echo of a question I'd long since buried. He wasn't a boy anymore. That was the first thing I noticed. Tall, confident, dressed in the muted tones of someone who had grown into his own skin. I tried to say something casual, something like "you've grown," but the words didn't come. He looked at me for a moment too long, not rudely, not flirtatiously, just knowingly. Like he remembered me too. But not as the woman I was now. As the woman I used to be. And maybe that was what shook me most of all. I stepped aside to let him in, my pulse thudding a little harder than usual. Behind him, the sun was already lowering into that late afternoon glow, and for a second, I imagined it swallowing him back into the driveway, like this visit had been a mistake. But no. He walked inside. I closed the door. The house didn't feel the same anymore. And neither did I. So before I tell you everything that followed, the afternoons, the silences, the choice I never thought I would make, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at someone you weren't supposed to love, and realized too late that something had already started between you? Write in the comments what city you're watching this from, and answer honestly, have you ever felt something begin when it should have never even had the chance? I was folding laundry when I got the call from her. It had been years since we'd spoken voice to voice, and I almost didn't pick up. The screen just said her name, no photo, no emoji, just the plain letters that reminded me of college parties, shared secrets, and the kind of friendships that fade slowly rather than break. I took a breath and answered. We didn't talk long. She was rushing. She said her son would be flying into town for 2 weeks before leaving the country for a permanent job overseas. Flights were expensive, hotels were nonsense. Could he stay with us? Just for a short time. Just like when he was little. I don't know why I agreed so quickly. Maybe it was politeness. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was that restless hum that had been living under my ribs for years now. The one that no amount of yoga or quiet dinners with my husband ever seemed to soothe. I didn't tell my husband right away. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I knew his answer would be indifference. And I was right. That night, over his second glass of wine, I told him that the boy, well, not a boy anymore, would be staying with us for 2 weeks. He nodded without looking up from his phone. Sure, he said. Just remind me of his name again. I did. He nodded again. That was the end of the conversation. The morning of his arrival, I cleaned the guest room twice. I opened the windows to let in the early autumn air, changed the sheets even though they were already clean. I stared too long at my reflection while brushing my hair, adjusting earrings I rarely wore anymore. I told myself it was about being a good hostess. The doorbell rang at 3:04 p.m. When I opened it, the air shifted. He stood there with a suitcase, a backpack slung over one shoulder, and a smile that still had some of the boy in it, but not much else did. His voice had changed, deeper now, with a tone that seemed more restrained than I remembered. He hugged me quickly, politely, but it was warm. Familiar. Not like the awkward gestures of someone you've forgotten. You look exactly the same, he said as he stepped inside. I almost laughed. I was 37 the last time I saw him. I'm over 50 now. He was being kind, or maybe he was just surprised. I doubt that, I said, smiling too brightly. But thank you. We had coffee in the kitchen. He told me about the job overseas, the language classes he'd been taking, the chaos of packing up his apartment. He said he wanted a few calm days before the move. This place always felt peaceful, he added, and something about the way he said it made me feel strangely honored. My husband didn't come home for dinner that night, he had a client dinner downtown. I didn't tell him our guest had arrived early. I wasn't sure why. We ate a simple meal, grilled vegetables, pasta, bread. I poured wine. He declined. The conversation was easy, which surprised me. I had thought it might be awkward, this grown man sitting across from me where once there had been a lanky 12-year-old who couldn't keep his elbows off the table. But there was none of that. After dinner, he offered to help clean up. I waved him off and told him to rest, but he followed me into the kitchen anyway. It wasn't awkward. It was quiet. Comfortable. I watched him from the corner of my eye as he examined the photographs on our refrigerator, my husband at a golf tournament, my daughter and her fiancé, our aging dog. Then there was a photo of me and him, taken decades ago. He smiled at it. I remember this, he said. You used to take me to the lake. You always brought juice boxes. I laughed. You had a terrifying obsession with apple juice. He leaned back against the counter and looked at me. Really looked. And for a moment, the air thickened between us. Not with anything romantic, at least not yet. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. A silent acknowledgement of time passing. Of how strange and uninvited intimacy could be, even in its most innocent form. I excused myself soon after. Said I had emails. Said he must be tired. But when I closed the door to my bedroom, I didn't open my laptop. I just sat there, hands in my lap, listening to the quiet of the house that suddenly didn't feel like mine. I undressed slowly. Not seductively, just carefully. Thoughtfully. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw someone I hadn't seen in a very long time. Someone not entirely invisible. That night, as I lay beside my sleeping husband, I stared at the ceiling and tried to count how many times I'd said no to myself over the past 20 years. No to travel. No to art classes. No to risky dresses. No to questions that had no neat answers. And I thought, maybe I've said no too many times. But I didn't let the thought stay. I pushed it down and closed my eyes. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The house was still, the kind of stillness that presses on your skin like thick air. I moved quietly, as if not to disturb something delicate. My husband was still asleep, his back turned toward me, breathing heavily. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, my hands resting on my knees, my thoughts like static in my mind. The memory of the night before hadn't faded, in fact, it felt sharper with the morning light. His face at the door. That calm gaze. The way he had looked at me, not like someone older, not like someone married, but simply as someone who mattered. And that was something I hadn't felt in years. Downstairs, the coffee brewed slowly. I stared at the rising steam as I waited, feeling restless. I wore a robe, loosely tied, and I didn't bother with makeup. It didn't feel necessary. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. But when I turned around, he was there, barefoot, in a faded t-shirt and joggers, eyes still heavy with sleep. "Good morning," he said quietly. I nodded, suddenly conscious of the way my robe clung to the shape of my body. I busied myself with mugs, pouring the coffee, adding cream to mine like always. He took his black, like an adult. Another thing that had changed. We sat at the kitchen table, facing each other but not looking directly at one another. The silence was easy at first, then not. I sipped, he sipped, and then we both looked up at the same time. It felt like stepping into something we hadn't agreed to. I stood quickly and began tidying up dishes that didn't need to be tidied. He leaned back in his chair and watched, but said nothing. There was no music, no background noise, only the occasional clink of ceramic and the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about asking him what his plans were for the day, but the words stayed lodged in my throat. Instead, he spoke. I think I'll go for a run. Clear my head. I nodded again. There's a trail behind the park, if you remember it. I do. I didn't walk him to the door, but I watched him through the window as he jogged down the driveway, long strides cutting through the morning fog. When he disappeared around the corner, I exhaled, as if I'd been holding something in since he'd entered the kitchen. Later that morning, my husband left for his weekend business trip. He packed with his usual efficiency, kissed me on the cheek, and reminded me to water the ferns. As he backed the car out of the driveway, I stood in the doorway and waved, smiling until he was out of sight. The smile faded the moment I closed the door. I spent the early afternoon sorting the linen closet. It was a task I'd put off for months, maybe longer, and today it seemed suddenly urgent. As I folded towels and organized pillowcases, my mind kept circling back to the guest room. I hadn't heard him come back from his run. I didn't know if he was showering, reading, napping. And I didn't know why I cared so much. I heard footsteps an hour later. He came downstairs in fresh clothes, hair still damp. He didn't say much, but there was a softness in his voice now. Not caution, not fear, something closer to gentleness. We spent the afternoon in the backyard. I tended to my plants while he sat nearby on the grass, sketching something in a small notebook. I didn't ask what. He didn't offer. Occasionally he would glance up and smile slightly, as if amused by my focus. I caught myself adjusting my posture, smoothing my dress, checking the way the sunlight hit my face. I wasn't trying to be seductive. I was just trying to be seen. Later, I made lemonade, and we drank it together under the shade of the old elm tree. We spoke in fragments, about music, about food, about how the neighborhood had changed. Nothing deep. Nothing dangerous. But everything felt charged, as though under each word there was something else waiting. The heat of the day gave way to a cooler evening. I changed into a loose blouse and cotton pants and started preparing dinner, roasted chicken, potatoes, and salad. Something simple, grounding. He offered to help, and I let him. We moved around the kitchen like we had done it before, like we had done it for years. At one point, we reached for the same dish, and our hands touched. It was a small thing. A fleeting contact. But the pulse that jumped through me was undeniable. I didn't pull away immediately. Neither did he. We both lingered, just a second too long. Just enough for everything to tilt. We didn't talk much during dinner. The air felt heavy with the things we weren't saying. Afterward, I stood by the sink washing dishes while he dried them silently beside me. I could feel the heat of his body next to mine, not touching, but close enough that it blurred the edges of propriety. Then it happened. We turned toward each other at the same time. No lead up. No speech. No slow unraveling. It was quiet. Swift. Certain. We kissed. And in that one instant, everything I had kept sealed behind careful lines, years of structure, routine, and restraint, cracked. But it was brief. Barely more than a breath. I stepped back. My hand went to my mouth as if to trap the moment, to rewind it somehow. He looked at me, not with regret or apology, but with something harder to face, understanding. I turned away, muttering something about needing to check on the laundry. He didn't stop me. He didn't follow. I walked upstairs, not looking back, and shut the door behind me with trembling hands. Inside the bedroom, I stood for a long time. I couldn't cry. I couldn't think. My reflection stared at me from the mirror, flushed, wide-eyed, unfamiliar. My skin tingled where his lips had touched mine. The room felt too quiet, too bright, too clean. I changed into pajamas though it was too early for bed and sat on the edge of the mattress, gripping the edge of the quilt like it might keep me from floating away. I told myself it was a mistake. That it didn't mean anything. That I had just misread the moment. But that was a lie. And I knew it. That night, I didn't sleep. Not from guilt. But because something had shifted and I couldn't unfeel it. The morning came with a quiet that pressed against the windows like a held breath. I lay in bed long after the sun had risen, staring at the ceiling, trying to will my thoughts into some form I could understand. But they swirled and scattered, refusing to settle. The night before had left me not shaken, but raw. It wasn't the kiss itself, brief, simple, almost restrained, but the realization that it hadn't felt foreign. It had felt natural, like a sentence waiting to be finished. And that, more than anything, unsettled me. I rose eventually, moving through my routine with mechanical precision. Brushed teeth. Washed face. Pulled my hair into a loose knot. I chose a modest dress, one I hadn't worn in months, and stared at myself in the mirror. I didn't look different. But I felt like I'd crossed a line, even if I couldn't yet see where it led. Downstairs, the house carried the same domestic rhythm, birds chirping faintly outside, the refrigerator humming, sunlight filtering through the blinds, but everything felt changed. I brewed coffee, the scent too strong. I set 2 mugs on the table without thinking, then hesitated. I considered putting one away, pretending yesterday hadn't happened, pretending nothing had shifted. But I left it. He entered the kitchen quietly, almost cautiously. His hair was damp again, his shirt plain gray, his movements unhurried. He greeted me with a soft smile and sat across from me as though we hadn't done what we'd done. As though everything was normal. And somehow, that unnerved me more than if he'd spoken about it. We didn't talk much. I sipped my coffee and kept my eyes on the window. He scrolled through something on his phone, then set it aside. The silence grew heavy. Not tense. Not hostile. But undeniably full. I wondered if he felt it too, or if he'd compartmentalized it better than I had. Later, I decided to get out of the house. I needed to move, to breathe air that didn't carry the echo of that moment. I told him I was running errands and slipped into my car without offering specifics. The drive felt both aimless and urgent. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to go. I ended up at a small shopping plaza 2 towns over, a place I used to frequent before life got too predictable. I walked through the aisles of a home decor store, fingering linens and looking at ceramic bowls I didn't need. I wasn't shopping. I was hiding. From my house. From him. From myself. At one point, I stood in front of a full-length mirror near a rack of scarves. The woman staring back at me looked tired, distracted. But there was something else in her eyes too, something restless. Something that had been dormant for years. I touched a hand to my collarbone and exhaled slowly. I bought nothing. I didn't need to. The store had served its purpose. When I returned home, the driveway was empty. I felt a flash of relief, followed immediately by disappointment. It was absurd, I told myself. I had gone out to avoid him. Now I was unsettled that he wasn't there. Inside, the house was tidy, quiet, still. I moved through it as though entering a museum of my own life, each room a frozen display. I ended up in the guest room. The bed was made neatly. His backpack was gone. So was his phone charger. For a moment, panic gripped me. Had he left? Without a word? But then I saw the note. It was resting on the edge of the desk, folded in half. My name written in his careful handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I stared at it, heart pounding, afraid of what it might say, and more afraid of what it might not. When I finally unfolded the paper, the message was simple. Went for a drive. Back by dinner. Needed some space to think. The relief I felt was disproportionate. I clutched the note tighter than I needed to and sat on the edge of the bed. Space to think. I could understand that. I needed the same thing. But we were running out of space, weren't we? The house was too small for the silence between us now. Dinner felt strange to prepare. I didn't know if he would want to eat with me. I didn't know if I wanted him to. But I cooked anyway. Chopped vegetables, seasoned fish, boiled rice. The familiarity of the motions helped steady me. He returned as the sun was beginning to set. I heard the car door, the front door, the creak of the floorboards. He didn't come to the kitchen immediately. I imagined him upstairs, dropping his keys on the dresser, washing his face, avoiding the mirror like I had. When he finally appeared, he didn't speak right away. Just leaned against the doorway and watched me plate the food. I placed a dish in front of him at the table and sat across from him, just like that first night. But everything between us was different now. Not ruined. Not yet. But undeniably altered. We ate mostly in silence. Occasionally, a comment about the flavor, the temperature, the softness of the rice. But nothing personal. Nothing about the note or the kiss. That part remained sealed between us, like a fragile agreement we didn't know how to acknowledge. After dinner, I washed the dishes while he dried them. Again, the rhythm felt practiced. Too intimate for strangers. Too distant for anything else. I was aware of his every movement, the way he passed me the plates, the occasional brush of his hand. But we didn't speak of it. When the kitchen was clean, he hesitated in the doorway. "I'm going to take a walk," he said quietly. I nodded. "Be careful." He offered a faint smile and left. I watched him from the window until he disappeared down the street. Then I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark. I didn't know what we were doing. I didn't know what I wanted. But I knew that something had begun. And it wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning came without warning. I must have fallen asleep sometime after midnight, the television still on in the background and the lights low enough to feel like dusk. I woke to the sound of birds just outside the window and a pale gray light slipping through the curtains. My mouth was dry, my body heavy. For a moment, I forgot what day it was. Then I remembered everything. There was no use pretending. I had crossed into a space that couldn't be undone, and even if I hadn't said it out loud, even if nothing had happened since that kiss, I was no longer just a wife hosting a family friend. I had become someone else. Or maybe I had simply stopped pretending I wasn't. Downstairs, the house smelled like citrus and warm wood. The lemon soap I'd used the night before still lingered faintly in the air. I moved quietly, hoping not to run into him immediately. Not because I didn't want to see him, but because I didn't know who I was when I did. Hostess? Friend? Something more complicated? He wasn't in the kitchen. I checked the driveway through the blinds, his car was there. The guest room door was closed. I lingered near it for a moment before heading back to the kitchen. I needed something to do. I needed routine. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the sink, staring out at the backyard. The garden looked wild. The bushes needed trimming, the weeds had crept into the flower beds, and the soil around the roses was dry. It had once been my pride. Now it looked like something I had slowly let go of. I changed into a pair of old jeans and a cotton shirt, pulled my hair back with a clip, and went outside with a pair of gloves and shears. The sun had barely climbed above the trees, and the ground was still damp from dew. I knelt in the dirt, clearing out the dead stems and thinning out the vines that had started to choke the weaker plants. My hands moved rhythmically, the sound of clipped branches falling onto the soil creating a strange calm. I didn't think about the house, or him, or even myself. I just worked. Sweat began to gather at my temples, and dirt crept beneath my fingernails, but I didn't care. For the first time in days, my mind was quiet. I didn't hear him come out. He was just suddenly there, a shadow cast across the grass. I looked up, startled, and saw him standing a few feet away, wearing a loose t-shirt and holding 2 mugs of coffee. "I figured you'd need another one," he said, offering me a mug. I took it without speaking. Our fingers brushed. Just for a moment. I looked away, focused on the roses. He sat down on the steps of the porch and watched me work. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck, on my arms, on the way I moved through the garden I used to love. I wondered what he was thinking. I wondered what I looked like to him now. Tired? Strange? Strong? Pathetic? I kept working. He kept watching. Eventually, I spoke. "It used to look better than this." He nodded. "Still beautiful, though." I wasn't sure if he meant the garden. We spent most of the morning out there, me in the dirt, him occasionally handing me tools or a bottle of water. The conversation was light. Unimportant. Safe. But something had shifted between us. Again. After I showered and changed, I found him in the living room reading a book from the shelf. I sat in the armchair across from him and watched him for a few minutes before he noticed. The silence between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was expectant. I needed to get out. "I'm going into town," I said, standing. "Do you need anything?" He shook his head. "I'll stay here." "Maybe cook tonight?" The offer was gentle. Not an intrusion. Not a suggestion of anything more. Just a gesture. I nodded. The drive into town felt longer than usual. Or maybe I was just slower. I wandered through the farmer's market without buying much, though I stopped to admire jars of honey and handmade soaps that reminded me of when I used to care about such things. I bought fresh bread and a small bunch of lavender. I didn't want to go home right away. The thought of the kitchen and the unfinished words between us made my chest tighten. So I parked near the lake, the one I used to take my daughter to when she was small. I sat on a bench, the bread in a paper bag beside me, and stared at the rippling water. I watched an older couple walk slowly along the shore, their hands lightly brushing, not quite held. There was something achingly tender in their pace, in the way they didn't speak. I wondered if they had survived what I hadn't even named yet. If they'd fought through temptation. Or grown so distant that temptation no longer visited them at all. I stayed there until the sun shifted position and the shadows stretched longer. When I returned home, the kitchen smelled of garlic and lemon. He had cooked pasta with vegetables, a salad, something baking in the oven that made the whole house feel warmer than it had in months. He was setting the table when I walked in. He glanced at me briefly, then looked away. I wondered if he could sense the way my thoughts swirled just under my skin. Dinner passed quietly. The food was good. Better than mine, in fact. I told him so. He smiled, thanked me. There were no mentions of the night before, no glances that lasted too long. Everything was normal. Polite. Respectful. And that made it harder. After we finished eating, I stood to clear the dishes, but he stopped me. "Let me," he said. "You've done enough today." I didn't argue. I walked into the living room and sat on the couch, listening to the soft clatter of plates and water running. I heard him humming quietly under his breath, a tune I didn't recognize, and I let the sound settle into me like a lullaby. When he was done, he came and sat in the chair across from me. Not too close. Not too far. We didn't speak for a long time. The night deepened around us, and the only light came from the lamp by the bookshelf. Eventually, he said, "I leave in 4 days." I nodded. "That's soon," I replied. "It is." I didn't ask how he felt about it. I didn't say I was sorry. There were too many things resting between those words. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the space between us. He stood first. "I think I'll head to bed early." "Good night," I said. He hesitated at the stairs. "Sleep well." I nodded. But I didn't sleep well. I stayed up, sitting in the same spot long after he had gone upstairs. The house was silent. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful but full of weight. I thought of his voice, his hands, the quiet steadiness of him. And I thought of myself, not the woman I had become over the years, but the one I used to be. The one who had dreams and sharp opinions and a hunger for more than duty. I didn't want to make a decision. I just wanted clarity. But clarity never comes when you ask for it. It only arrives when you've already crossed the line and are looking back, wondering how you ever thought the world was still the same. The morning light filtered through the curtains with an almost intrusive brightness. It crept across the hardwood floor, up the foot of the bed, and settled gently on my face, as if reminding me that no matter what happened behind closed doors, the world still turned, indifferent to human contradiction. I sat up slowly, my back stiff from another night of shallow sleep. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, not from heat, but from memory. My husband was due back today. I checked my phone for updates, nothing yet. Just the silence between messages, and the longer silence between who we used to be and who we'd become. I spent the first hour of the day aimlessly. I straightened the cushions on the living room sofa, watered the succulents on the window ledge, wiped down a countertop that was already clean. Movement helped fill the space, helped keep my thoughts from circling too tightly around the one fact I couldn't shake: he was still here. The guest upstairs. The grown man who used to be just a boy I remembered in shorts and sneakers, chasing butterflies and dripping popsicles. He came downstairs around 9. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, and with each creak of the stairs, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. I had told myself that if we kept our distance, the moment would pass, the mistake would fade. But now, just the sound of him approaching made me feel undone in a way I couldn't explain. He entered the kitchen with that quiet calmness he always carried, like he didn't want to disturb the air. He wore a dark blue t-shirt and jeans, hair slightly tousled, barefoot. There was no tension in his shoulders, no awkwardness in his posture. And yet, I saw it. In the way his eyes flicked toward me and then away. In how he hesitated, just slightly, before opening the cupboard to get a mug. I offered him coffee. He accepted with a small nod. We sat at the table again, just like we had on the first day, the first morning, the first of so many small collisions that led us to now. Breakfast was simple. Toast, eggs, fruit. I kept myself busy with dishes, asking him if he needed anything, if he slept well. He answered, but the words felt like placeholders, like we both understood this wasn't really about eggs or how we'd slept. I told him my husband was coming back today. He paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, then nodded again. No comment. No change in his expression. But the shift was there, subtle but present. The day moved slowly after that. I tried to immerse myself in errands again, this time within the house. I stripped the bed in the guest room, washed the sheets, reorganized the linen closet for no particular reason. He stayed mostly out of sight, upstairs or out on the back patio with his notebook, writing or sketching, I never asked which. By mid-afternoon, the air felt thick with heat and something unspoken. I stood by the window watching the breeze rustle the leaves, and then I saw him in the garden, shirtless, pulling weeds near the fence. It wasn't provocative. It wasn't deliberate. But something inside me unraveled further. I stepped outside with cold water and handed him a glass. He smiled his thanks, took it, drank deeply. The sight of him there, sweat on his forehead, dirt on his hands, felt far too intimate for the boundaries I had once lived within so easily. I turned to go, but he reached out and gently touched my wrist. We kissed. It was not planned. It was not dramatic. It was quiet and certain and inevitable. We kissed. Then, almost as suddenly, we parted. No words. No explanations. He returned to the garden. I went back inside. But nothing was the same. I tried to cook that evening, but my hands felt clumsy. I burned the onions. Dropped a spoon. Forgot to add salt. He came in halfway through and offered to take over. I let him. I stood in the corner of the kitchen, arms folded, watching him move through the space like he'd always belonged there. As if he'd never left. As if he'd never have to. The food was good. It always was when he cooked. We ate in the dining room, a more formal space we rarely used. The chandelier buzzed faintly overhead. I had set the table with cloth napkins and wine glasses, trying to fill the room with something normal. Something adult. Something detached from what had happened earlier in the garden. I could feel his gaze occasionally drifting to me, and each time it did, I felt the weight of the moment settle deeper into my spine. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This wasn't confusion. This was something becoming real, and I didn't know what to do with it. After dinner, he cleared the plates without being asked. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the back porch while he washed up. The evening air was cooler than I expected, and I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders. The yard looked soft and gold in the fading light. He joined me a few minutes later, sitting a careful distance away. We didn't speak for a while. The silence felt almost comforting now. He finally broke it. I leave in 3 days. I nodded, staring at the sky. I know. Another pause. Then, it's gone by fast. Too fast, I replied before I could stop myself. We didn't look at each other. We didn't have to. Eventually, he stood. I think I'll turn in. I nodded again, but before he walked inside, he turned toward me. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then smiled sadly. For making this house feel alive. And then he disappeared inside. I stayed outside long after the stars came out, long after the wine had gone warm in my glass. The house behind me glowed softly through the windows. Inside it were rooms full of ordinary things, furniture, framed photos, folded towels. But none of it felt ordinary anymore. Everything had shifted. And nothing would go back to what it was. The house felt too full and too empty all at once. My husband returned just after noon. I had expected a text, a call, some notice before he pulled into the driveway, but instead, I heard the engine and saw the flash of his car in the window, and something in me tensed before I could control it. I stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as the front door opened and his familiar steps echoed through the hallway. He called out my name casually, not with warmth or curiosity, but out of routine. I answered with the same tone. He came into the kitchen, kissed me on the cheek, asked if everything had been all right. I nodded, told him the house had been quiet, which wasn't a lie, but not the truth either. He didn't ask for more. The bags he carried were dropped near the stairs. He loosened his tie, complained about traffic, then made himself a drink without offering me one. I watched him move through the space that still bore traces of someone else, an empty mug on the porch railing, a folded shirt on the laundry chair, shoes tucked neatly near the back door. My husband didn't notice any of it. We moved through the rest of the afternoon in parallel. I asked about his trip, and he answered in practical terms: clients, delays, meetings that ran long. He asked nothing of me. I made small talk about errands, about laundry, about dinner plans. He didn't comment when I said I hadn't cooked yet. He went upstairs to shower. I stood in the living room, staring at the clock, listening to the water run above me. The sound made me feel suddenly disoriented, like I couldn't tell which version of my life I was standing in anymore. Later, I found him in the study, watching something on his tablet with his headphones in. I stood at the door for a moment, thinking I would say something, ask him if he wanted to take a walk, maybe sit outside, but I didn't. He looked content, or at least distracted, and that was enough for now. I went into the kitchen and began preparing dinner, not out of hunger, but obligation. Something neutral: grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, rice. It gave my hands something to do, gave my thoughts a structure to move within. I didn't think about who would be at the table or what words would fill the space between bites. He came down when the food was ready. He thanked me. We ate quietly. He talked about a podcast he'd listened to, something about finance or politics. I didn't retain the details. I nodded in the right places, smiled when appropriate. It was the kind of dinner we'd had 1,000 times before. Comfortable. Predictable. Safe. Afterward, he helped with the dishes. I noticed he loaded the dishwasher differently than our guest had. Less careful. More automatic. He dried his hands on the towel by the sink, kissed me on the forehead, and went back to the study. That night, the bed felt smaller than usual. He fell asleep quickly, breathing evenly, one hand resting across his chest. I lay on my side, facing the window, counting the seconds between each breath. I didn't cry. I didn't fidget. I just existed in that narrow space between wanting and knowing better. The next day passed in much the same way. I found myself checking my phone often, though there were no messages I was expecting. None that would come. He kept to himself, and so did I. We moved through the house like people playing their parts in a play that had long lost its audience. Late in the afternoon, I stepped outside with a book and a blanket, hoping the sun might help clear my thoughts. I didn't read. I sat in the patio chair, watching the wind push through the trees, feeling the weight of the days I could no longer name without guilt. Each one blurred into the next. A few weeks ago, everything had been simple. Boring, even. Now I couldn't make sense of what was real and what was just the echo of something I wanted. He joined me there, not my husband, but the one who hadn't left yet. He carried a glass of iced tea and sat down across from me without asking. We didn't speak at first. The quiet stretched between us, gentle but charged. "I've been thinking about leaving early," he said eventually, his voice low. My stomach twisted. "Why?" He hesitated. "It feels complicated. And I didn't come here to make things harder." I looked away. The sky was pale, the clouds soft and stretched. I wanted to say something that would undo the tension, but there was no simple sentence for this. "You didn't make anything harder," I said finally. "Not alone." He gave a short nod, as if that was all he needed to hear. We didn't touch. We didn't move closer. But something passed between us in that silence, something more honest than anything we could have said out loud. The next morning, I found a note in the kitchen. Just a few lines. Thank you for the space. For the quiet. I'll leave tomorrow. I think that's best. I'm grateful for the time we had. There was no signature. He didn't need one. I folded the note and placed it in the drawer beneath the cutlery, unsure why I couldn't throw it away. That day, I told my husband we should go out for dinner. He looked surprised but agreed. We made a reservation at a restaurant we hadn't visited in over a year. The food was good, the wine better. We talked about old trips and mutual friends, about news stories and weather. He looked at me differently that evening. Maybe because I was dressed nicer than usual, maybe because I reached across the table once and touched his hand. He smiled. For a moment, it felt like we might return to something. But I wasn't sure if it was the past or just a well-rehearsed version of it. That night, we lay in bed side by side. He touched my shoulder, a slow, familiar gesture, and I turned to him. I let him kiss me, slow and tired and soft. There was no urgency, no need. Just contact. Just habit. I closed my eyes and let it happen. Not out of guilt. Not out of longing. But because part of me wanted to feel something familiar, even if I wasn't sure it still fit. He fell asleep quickly afterward. I lay awake for hours, eyes open to the dark, counting down to the moment the door would close behind someone I couldn't ask to stay. 3 days had become 2. And 2 would become 1. The house was unusually quiet that morning. Even the refrigerator, usually humming gently in the background, seemed to have dulled its sound. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the steam from my coffee curling slowly into the air. It was still dark outside, just before sunrise, and the world felt suspended in a moment that wasn't quite night or day. The kind of in-between that echoed how I felt inside. I had barely slept. My husband was still in bed, breathing steadily, unaware that I had risen before dawn. I hadn't even planned to get up early. My body had done it on its own, as if some part of me had decided this day required more time. More space. Today was his last full day in the house. I knew that the moment I opened my eyes. Not because of the note he'd left or the conversations we'd avoided, but because of the weight in my chest that had grown heavier with each passing hour. This was a day I had both wished for and feared. The final day. The one that would mark the end of whatever it was we had shared, and whatever it was we hadn't dared to name. I moved through my morning slowly. I dressed without urgency, pulling on clothes I hadn't worn in years, a soft blouse, jeans that still fit well enough. I brushed my hair but left it loose, as if allowing something about myself to remain unfinished. I didn't wear makeup. I didn't feel the need to mask anything. When I came downstairs again, he was in the living room, seated on the floor with his back against the couch, notebook open in his lap. He looked up when he saw me but didn't speak. I nodded in greeting and walked to the kitchen. I poured him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one. I just knew. I brought it to him, placed it beside his knee, and sat down in the armchair. The air between us was calm. Not empty. Just stripped down to its essentials. After a few minutes, he closed the notebook and set it aside. I thought I'd drive out to the lake, he said. Just to see it one more time. I hesitated before responding. I could go with you. He looked at me then, not surprised. Not cautious. Just quietly accepting. If you want to. We didn't take the main highway. He drove the older route, the one that curved along the backroads and dipped through stretches of trees. I stared out the window most of the way, my thoughts a slow tangle of memories and imagined outcomes. I could see his reflection in the glass, his eyes on the road, steady hands on the wheel. He didn't speak much, and I didn't need him to. When we arrived, the lake looked almost exactly as I remembered it from years ago, still, wide, and framed by trees beginning to blush with the first signs of autumn. The air smelled faintly of pine and water. We stepped out of the car in silence. We walked along the narrow dirt path at the edge of the lake, our footsteps muffled by fallen leaves. The sun was rising behind the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. We stopped near the old dock, the one with the weathered boards and the rusty railing that no one had ever bothered to fix. I leaned on it with both hands, looking out at the water. He stood beside me. "This place hasn't changed much," I said softly. "No," he agreed. "But everything else has." There was nothing dramatic in his voice. Just quiet truth. We sat down on the edge of the dock, letting our legs dangle over the side. The water lapped gently below. I didn't know what I was waiting for, an apology, a confession, a plan, but none of that came. What came was presence. A deep, aching stillness that felt more honest than words. I picked up a pebble and rolled it between my fingers before tossing it into the lake. The ripples spread outward, smooth and wide, then disappeared. "I don't regret it," I said finally, not looking at him. "Any of it." He didn't answer immediately. "Neither do I." We didn't touch. We didn't cry. There was no need for dramatics. What we had shared lived in the silence. In the long glances. In the mornings like this one, where everything said more by being unsaid. Eventually, we stood. He took one last look at the lake, then turned back toward the car. I followed. The walk back felt shorter, as though time had snapped back into its regular rhythm. The drive home was just as quiet as the drive there. I watched the landscape roll by, my hands folded in my lap. He reached out once, briefly, to adjust the heat, and in that moment, his hand brushed mine. Neither of us pulled away. When we returned to the house, my husband had already left for an appointment. The silence inside felt different now, thicker, more final. He set his keys on the counter and looked at me. "I need to pack," he said. I nodded. "I'll be in the garden." I stepped outside and knelt in the soil without gloves. I pulled weeds. Trimmed dead branches. Watered the flowers that had started to bend. I needed to move. To do something that felt tangible. My hands became covered in dirt, and I didn't bother to wipe them clean. After an hour, I saw him walk past the window, suitcase in hand. He paused, looked outside, met my eyes. I stood slowly, dusted off my knees, and walked to the front door. He was already there, waiting. "This is goodbye," he said gently. "Yes," I whispered. There were no declarations. No last-minute changes. Just a long, silent look that seemed to stretch across all the days we had shared. And then we spent the night together. It happened without words, without planning. Only stillness, presence, understanding. No promises were made. No futures were imagined. The next morning, when I woke, he was gone. The room was quiet. His things were gone. The bed beside me was empty. But on the nightstand, folded neatly, was a single piece of paper. I didn't open it right away. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the birds outside begin their morning songs, knowing something had ended. And something else had started. Not a new love. Not a new story. Just a return to myself. The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was the quiet. It was a deeper kind of silence than usual, an absence, not just of sound, but of presence. The kind that settles in a space when something or someone has gone. I turned my head toward the window. The light was soft, the kind that comes right before the sun fully rises. It stretched across the bedsheets and illuminated the nightstand, where a single piece of folded paper waited patiently. I didn't reach for it. Not right away. I just looked at it, breathing slowly, feeling the stillness settle into my bones. My husband's side of the bed was empty. He had risen early, likely already gone to his office or morning routine. That had become his pattern over the years. Efficient, independent, detached. It made mornings easier to navigate, though now it felt like another echo of the distance we'd let grow between us. Eventually, I sat up. My body felt heavier than usual, as though my limbs had absorbed the weight of the last few days. I reached for the note and unfolded it carefully, as if it might fall apart in my hands. There were only a few lines, written in his clear, steady handwriting. I didn't say goodbye because I didn't want to make it harder. You gave me more than I expected, and I will carry that quietly with me. Thank you for all of it. Be well. I folded the paper again and placed it in the drawer of my nightstand. Not hidden, but not on display either. It didn't feel like something that needed to be revisited often. Just something that had happened. Something that had changed me. The rest of the morning passed like a shadow. I moved through it without sharp thought. Made coffee. Toasted bread. Watered the plants. The familiarity of the rituals grounded me, but everything felt slightly out of focus, like the world had been pushed a few inches out of alignment. I found myself walking through the rooms, straightening things that didn't need straightening. I paused in the guest room and stood there for a long time. The bed was made. The suitcase was gone. The space was clean, as if untouched. But I could still feel the warmth in the air, the echo of footsteps, the invisible imprint of his presence. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my hands rest in my lap. There were no tears, no overwhelming sorrow, just a dull ache that moved slowly through my chest. The kind of ache that comes when something beautiful and temporary passes through your life and leaves before you can fully understand it. Later that afternoon, my husband returned home. He greeted me with a short smile, asked if I needed anything from the store, then disappeared into his office without waiting for an answer. He didn't ask if our guest had left. I didn't offer it. We both continued as if nothing had shifted. As if everything was still in its place. And in a way, it was. That night, I stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing a dish long after it was clean. I stared out the window at the darkened yard, watching the wind move gently through the trees. I thought about what I'd felt out at the lake. That brief moment of complete clarity. Not about the future, not about what was right or wrong, but about myself. About who I had been. Who I was now. Who I could still be. I didn't sleep much that night either. The bed felt vast again, like I was sharing it with silence instead of another person. I lay awake, eyes open, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaks, the hums, the occasional sigh of old wood settling. Each sound felt like a reminder of how long I had lived in this space, how many years I had spent turning myself down to make room for everything else. The next morning, I rose early and decided to clean the closet in the hallway. It had nothing to do with necessity. I just needed something that required my hands and not my heart. I sorted old coats, folded scarves, collected shoes that hadn't been worn in years. Each item held a fragment of memory, but I didn't linger on any of them. I just made space. In the back of the closet, tucked behind a stack of folded blankets, I found a small box I had forgotten about. Inside were letters, some from my daughter, some from old friends, and one I didn't recognize at first. When I opened it, I realized it was something I had written to myself nearly a decade ago. A letter I had written and sealed after a therapy session I barely remembered attending. The handwriting was my own, but slightly different. A little more hopeful. A little less weary. It said, "You are not disappearing. You are not too late. You are not lost. I sat on the floor for a long time, the letter in my lap, the closet door open behind me. I read the words again and again until they stopped feeling like fiction. That evening, I made dinner and set the table for two. My husband joined me, tired from the day. We ate quietly. I asked how his meetings had gone. He gave short answers. He asked how the garden was doing. I said it needed rain. We spoke like people who had once loved each other and now lived in a soft echo of that love. After dinner, I went out to the patio with a book, but I didn't read. I watched the light fade and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood, distant cars, the rustling of trees, the occasional bark of a dog. I thought about how many years I had spent waiting for something to change without ever admitting that I could be the one to change it. It didn't matter that he was gone now. What mattered was what he had stirred awake in me. Not desire, not rebellion, not escape, but awareness. Of time. Of presence. Of longing that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with being seen. As the sky darkened and the stars appeared one by one, I stood and wrapped a shawl around my shoulders. I walked to the edge of the yard and looked up at the sky, letting the cool air press gently against my skin. I whispered something to no one, not expecting a response. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't a question. It was a beginning. One I hadn't been ready for until now. The days that followed passed without ceremony. He was gone, and the house responded in kind, settling into a stillness that was almost too quiet, as if trying to erase the echo of his presence from its walls. Yet I felt him everywhere. In the way the morning sunlight fell across the dining table. In the towel still folded neatly in the guest bathroom. In the extra chair I no longer glanced toward at breakfast. Absence has a way of marking territory more precisely than presence ever can. My husband resumed his routines easily, as though nothing had shifted. He returned to his work, his meetings, his emails late into the night. He kissed me on the cheek when he left in the mornings and sometimes mentioned headlines over dinner. I responded out of reflex, not emotion. We shared space, not closeness. And that arrangement, once acceptable, now sat like a quiet ache beneath the surface of my skin. One morning, I walked to the local bookstore for no reason other than to be somewhere else. The place was familiar but oddly comforting in its smallness. I wandered the aisles without purpose, running my fingers across spines, picking up covers that caught my eye, flipping through pages I knew I wouldn't read. I ended up in the back, in a section filled with journals and blank notebooks. I chose one without thinking, hardcover, linen-bound, soft gray. No lines. Just empty space. I took it home, sat at the kitchen table with a pen, and stared at the first page for a long time. Then I began to write. Not a story. Not a confession. Just thoughts. Fragments. Things I hadn't said aloud. Things I didn't even realize I believed until they were inked in front of me. That became a habit. Each morning, I would write something. A memory. A detail. A truth I'd spent years avoiding. It was as though the act of putting pen to paper gave shape to the person I had neglected becoming. Not the woman I once was, and not the one I had tried to be for so long, but someone else entirely. Someone I was still learning to recognize. One afternoon, I received a message from my daughter. She wanted to visit. It had been months. I told her yes, of course, and then spent the next 2 days preparing the house in ways that felt unnecessary but important. I changed sheets, fluffed pillows, stocked the fridge with things she liked. I found myself wondering how she would look at me now. Would she notice the difference? Would she hear it in my voice? When she arrived, she hugged me tightly. She looked older, sharper, and yet still held that softness in her eyes I remembered from her childhood. She complimented the flowers on the table. She asked how I'd been. I told her I was fine. That was our rhythm: kind questions, vague answers, shared laughter. We didn't press too hard. Not yet. That evening, she asked to help cook. We moved around the kitchen together, shoulder to shoulder, hands brushing now and then. She told me stories about her work, her friends, someone new she had started seeing. I listened, smiling, genuinely happy to hear her speak. Her voice filled the house in a way I hadn't realized I'd missed. After dinner, she curled up on the couch and looked at me with a seriousness that made my chest tighten. "You seem different," she said quietly. "Not bad different. Just different." I paused, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Do I?" She nodded. "Calmer, maybe. Like something settled." I didn't respond right away. I sat beside her, folded the towel in my lap, and stared at the television that wasn't on. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "we change without realizing it. Or maybe we realize it, but we don't know what to do with the change, so we pretend we haven't." She looked at me for a long time, then leaned her head on my shoulder. "Whatever it is, I think it suits you." I didn't cry. But the warmth in my throat told me I could have. After she left, the house felt both fuller and emptier. The echo of her laughter lingered in the hallway. Her tea mug sat on the drying rack by the sink. I let it stay there for an extra day. That week, I started painting again. It had been years. I wasn't good, not by any technical standard, but that didn't matter. I set up in the back sunroom, opened the windows, and let the breeze carry the smell of paint and possibility through the house. I worked in silence, or sometimes with soft music in the background. It wasn't about creating anything beautiful. It was about the act itself: movement, expression, release. One morning, while mixing colors, I found myself painting a shoreline. A lake, wide and quiet, trees bending over the edge. I hadn't planned it. The image just came. When I stepped back and looked at it, my breath caught. I left it unfinished. Some things are more honest that way. I saw my husband less during those days. He spent more time at the office, came home later, often fell asleep on the couch with his laptop open. We rarely argued. We rarely touched. Our conversations were functional. Polite. We lived side by side, like two people preserving a space they no longer entered. And I no longer resented him for that. One night, I stood by the kitchen window with a cup of tea and watched the wind move through the garden. The moonlight cast soft shadows across the flower beds. I thought about how different everything looked in the dark. Not more frightening, just more honest. I didn't miss him, not in the way people expect when someone leaves. I missed the version of myself I had put aside for so long. But she was returning, piece by piece. That night, before bed, I opened my journal and wrote only one sentence. "I'm still here." And that was enough. It was a Thursday morning when I found myself standing in front of the closet, suitcase open on the bed, hands hovering over sweaters and folded blouses I hadn't worn in years. The air in the bedroom was still, the kind of stillness that feels like an invitation. Or a dare. I hadn't planned to go anywhere, not officially. But when I woke that morning, something in me had whispered, "It's time." Time for what? I wasn't entirely sure. A change, certainly. Maybe not a grand departure, but something quieter. Something that shifted the rhythm of the days, if only slightly. I packed lightly. A few simple outfits. Comfortable shoes. My journal. A small paperback novel I hadn't yet opened. I left the top of the suitcase unzipped, not out of forgetfulness, but because even now, a part of me wasn't sure if I'd really go. My husband was out, another early meeting. I left a note on the kitchen counter, gone for a few days. Don't worry. I'll call tonight. I signed it with my name, not love, not yours. Just my name. It felt more honest that way. I didn't drive far. Just to the coast, to a small town we had once visited as a family when my daughter was still little. I remembered the hotel vaguely, white siding, flower boxes in the windows, a creaky wooden staircase that led up to rooms with slightly uneven floors. It was still there. It looked older now, but in the way that made it feel more like a place, less like a business. I checked in under my full name and requested a room with a view of the water. The receptionist, a woman with soft eyes and a kind smile, handed me the key without asking questions. The room smelled faintly of sea air and furniture polish. The window overlooked a sloping hill that led down to the shoreline, where a few people walked slowly, their jackets tugged by the wind. I placed my suitcase in the corner, sat on the edge of the bed, and listened. No television. No voices. Just the quiet hush of distant waves and the occasional cry of a gull. I didn't feel free. Not exactly. But I felt light. Like I had peeled off a layer I didn't know I'd been wearing. That afternoon, I wandered through the town. I stopped at a used bookshop, bought a collection of essays I would likely never finish, and had lunch alone at a cafe with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu. No one looked at me strangely. No one asked where I was from. I blended in, and for once, I liked that feeling. I sat by the water that evening, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the sky darken by degrees. The horizon melted from pink to orange to soft gray. I didn't think of him, not in the way I had expected to. I didn't replay the moments or search for meaning in them. I simply acknowledged them, like you would a chapter in a book you've closed. There was no bitterness. No ache. Just a quiet kind of knowing. Back at the hotel, I wrote for a long time. Pages filled with slow thoughts and incomplete sentences. I wasn't searching for clarity anymore. I was recording it. Tracing the outline of who I had become in the aftermath. The next morning, I took a walk before breakfast. The wind was brisk but not unfriendly. My coat was too thin, but I didn't mind. I passed a bench overlooking the water and sat for a while, hands in my pockets, hair pulled back messily. An older couple walked by, arms linked loosely. They smiled at me. I smiled back. Later that day, I met a woman near the hotel garden. She was reading beneath an arbor covered in climbing ivy. We talked briefly about the weather, about how the roses would bloom late this year. She mentioned she visited the town once a year to escape the noise of the city. Sometimes, she said, you don't know how loud your life is until you step away from it. I nodded, though I didn't say much. We sat in a companionable silence for a while. Before I left, she looked at me and said, you seem like someone who's just beginning something. That night, I dreamed I was walking along the lake from my childhood, barefoot, the water just brushing my toes. I wasn't running from anything. I wasn't waiting for anyone. I was simply walking. Moving forward. When I returned home 2 days later, the house didn't feel foreign. It felt lived in, the way old shoes remember the shape of your feet. My husband was reading in the living room. He looked up when I entered, closed his book, and asked, how was it? I shrugged off my coat. Good. Quiet. He nodded. I'm glad. We didn't talk more that evening. We didn't need to. There were no apologies required. No explanations offered. The air between us wasn't heavy. It wasn't light either. It simply was. I unpacked slowly. I returned the book to the shelf, folded the blanket from the car, watered the plants that had begun to droop. In the bedroom, I pulled open the drawer of the nightstand and found the note still there. I didn't read it again. I just moved it gently aside and placed my journal on top. That evening, I stood in the hallway, hand resting on the doorknob of the guest room. I opened it, let the light spill in, and stepped inside. The room was clean. Plain. Undisturbed. I sat on the edge of the bed and breathed deeply. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat there, surrounded by the quiet. Eventually, I stood, turned off the light, and closed the door behind me. Not as an ending, but as a beginning.